Welcome to the Il Duce podcast, a podcast on change and legacies in Italy. I'm your host Diego, and in our 9th episode of a series and our final one on fascism, we'll examine fascist economics and the legacies of its policies. We start this episode with pasta, one, if not the most famous, of Italian dishes. Pasta takes centre stage in a bizarre fascist policy, the war on pasta. You heard me right. The fascist regime decided to go to war against a much-loved dish. Pasta was represented as slavery to foreign powers, and the grand passion for pasta was declared an Italian weakness. Instead, true Italians ate rice. Eating rice was promoted by the Ente Nazionale Risi, or the National Rice Board, who promoted rice as the food of soldiers and healthy babies, often creating posters of smiling toddlers sitting on a bag of rice. So, what compelled the regime to make its incursion into the very food Italians eat? The answer lies in fascism and its economics ideas. Fascist economics can combine elements of old and new, creating a mess of often contradictory policies and ideas. These policies led to fascism invading the kitchen and the personal lives of Italians. Pasta did not make you less virile or fertile or made you un-Italian. Pasta was simply made from imported wheat, an unacceptable reality for a regime striving for self-sufficiency. Fascist economics is a story of compromise, propaganda, and legacies that stretched on for decades well into Republican Italy. Before we begin to talk about what fascism actually did, we'll focus on its economic ideology. Fascism followed a model of political economy. They believed the economy should be merged with the political as a tool to achieve their goals. The economy would become the main tools used by the fascist regime to promote its imperialistic and militaristic goals. Fascist economics can be simplified into three core principles: productivism, autarky, and corporatism. Productivism can be argued as the most important one, as it sets the ideological basis for the next two core principles. Productivism is a belief that states that the core policy of any state organization is to maximize the productivity and resources available in an economy. Fascism did not see class struggle as a fight between different socio-economic groups, such as the proletariat or the bourgeois, but rather as a conflict between plutocratic nations, democracies, and Italy. Fascism saw the nation as the single most important social community, and thus economic problems and conflicts were always framed in the national terms and in between nations. To win this struggle, Italy needed to modernize quickly and expand its productive capacity. Italy was starved of resources, and thus the only recourse was rapid economic development and industrial expansion to feed the Italian war machine and the population's need. Fascism rejected both socialist and liberal views of the economy. Liberalism would reduce Italy to a dependent client of the plutocratic nations, while socialism would waste the precious few resources on redistributive projects. These beliefs were originally conjured up by Alfredo Rocco, a nationalist, but were wholeheartedly supported and taken on board by the fascists. The second pillar to fascist economics policies were autarky or self-sufficiency. Italy imported large amounts of raw material from abroad, especially coal and iron ore. This left it economically, but especially militarily dependent on plutocratic nations. If Italy wanted to win in its existential class struggle, it would need to become self-sufficient in every way possible. This would involve exploiting every possible raw material deposit in Italy, commercial ventures in other countries such as Romania for oil, and finally, imperial conquest. It would, however, also need to involve a major restructuring of the average Italian's life. As explained before, pasta and bread were made from imported wheat and thus weakened Italy. The regime thus intervened heavily in the kitchen. Fascist magazines promoted modernized kitchens with well-kept interiors, and fascist cookbooks changed anglicized words into more Italian-sounding ones, such as the change of bar to quisi beve, to wean Italians off foreign products. Italians had to sacrifice some of their comforts to a state who supposedly held their interests at heart. Self-sufficiency would ensure Italy would grow militarily, with steel for tanks and ships being produced in Italy rather than having to be imported. Autarky is often mistaken as a pragmatic response to the League of Nations sanctions due to their invasion in Abyssinia. But, as you will prove later in this episode, autarky played an integral part in fascist economic policies and always existed. Now we come to the last and most complicated and confusing part: corporatism. The Italian anti-fascist Gaetano Salvemini said that the corporative system was like searching in a black room for a black cat that didn't exist. It was, in all honesty, more of a propaganda tool than an effective way to manage an economy. Corporatism is a system which sought to establish a new system of representation of workers and economic management. The corporatist system worked by creating corporations made up of all the workers and employees in a particular sector who worked together for the national interest. These corporations would be self-regulating and discuss all matters concerned with production, working conditions, pay, etc. It stressed unity over the pursuit of class interests, as this would lead to the greatest benefit for all. Individualism was to be destroyed. Individuals were to be identified only as producers and confined to single roles and strictly identified with that role. There would be no employers and no workers, only producers. It was used by fascists as a propaganda tool to show the ideology as a promising third way between socialism and capitalism. However, reality was a little bit different. Corporations and the entire systems were the brainchild of the syndicalist fascist unions, who believed they could dominate the system by representing the workers' demand. It was obviously bitterly hated by business interests, and the whole process of just creating the framework of the system was a long drawn-out compromise that ended in an unbalanced system skewed in favour of the industrialists. The syndicalists supported a cooperative system that will not only deal with labour issues, but also run the economy and create a new status quo, controlled by them and controlled by more radical fascists. As one can guess, this spooked the industrialists and Confindustria, a confederation of employers who Mussolini could not lose the support of. The syndicalists had already won the monopoly of representation in 1925 between them and Confindustria, and Mussolini could not allow a state within a state that would likely emerge if the syndicalists got their way. Thus he had to discipline labour, and this discipline is what killed the system before it was even born. How can a system based around representation of workers work if the representative function is basically non-existent? The 1926 Rocco Law confirmed the position of fascist syndicalists as a solo representative of labour, but also weakened them considerably. Pursuit of socio-economic interests was subordinated to the principle and goals of fascism, and only associations that could prove their proof of sound national loyalty were to be recognised. This led to the syndicalists having to answer to the state. Workers were removed as a source of legitimacy for unions, and unions became more of a tool used to regiment workers and actually represent them. The law also banned strike and lockouts, which was a massive win for the industrialists. Thus, when the system began to be slowly created, beginning in 1927, it was severely unbalanced. Workers were represented by severely weakened trade unions, and employers represented themselves. By 1934, there were 22 corporations, but they were effectively powerless, being bypassed by Confindustria below and state intervention from above. They were barely able to sort out worker and employee representation, let alone run the economy. It was a great propaganda victory, but it was a facade for the continued exploitation of workers. Now that we have seen what fascist economics' core principles were, we will see how these policies were implemented by the regime. In the early years of fascism, economics policies were rather mild or normal. Mussolini appointed De Stefani as finance minister, who, with his special decree powers, proceeded to reform the nation's fiscal system, abolish taxes on war, property and profits, all in the name of stimulating savings and capital investment. The fascists privatized the telephone system whilst also saving Ansaldo, a mechanical engineering firm, from liquidation. It also created a parastate consortium to provide low-interest capital loans to industry. It was all in all a relatively coherent and well-managed program. Iron and steel production doubled between 1922 and 26, as did electrical power generation. By 1929, industrial production was 142% of that in 1913. Fordism was slowly being introduced into Italian factories, leading to some of the highest output per man-hour in Europe. Agriculture, road and railways all began to be modernized. However, this growth proved to be short-term. It led to a huge trade deficit and a plunging of the lira that dropped to 150 lire for £1. This was incompatible with the core ideal of autarky and self-sufficiency, and the regime saw this as an opportunity to expand their control in the economy and tactically begin to mobilize the economic resources for political gain. The crisis of the lira led to two important consequences. The first was the battle for grain. This campaign sought to make Italy independent of foreign grain imports. As early as 1923, the fascist government introduced prizes to farmers who increased their yield. In 1925, it became official, with a systemic program to increase the cereal and grain yield of the peninsula. A large portion of the propaganda machinery of the state was involved to help to increase the productivity of Italian agriculture, showing videos of Mussolini threshing wheat and of mechanical tractors ploughing up the land. Fascist architecture was also involved, as usual, with fountains being built to represent heads of wheat, and churches built to look like grain elevators. The campaign was a success for all accounts. Productivity increased from 10.5 to 13.9 quintals per hectare in 1931 and reached 15.2 in 1932. By 1935, Italy was no longer compelled to expend 15% of its total foreign exchange reserves for the importation of cereals. The battle for grain proved to be the beginning of political interference in the economy. The second development was the battle for the lira. Mussolini, against the advice of basically everyone, chose to stabilize the lira at quota 90 or 90 lire for £1. A strong currency would be a political victory, but an economic nightmare. Exports declined by 60% and it led to a period of deflation in the Italian economy. The battle for the lira is significant, as alongside the battle for grain, it proved to be the beginning of autarkic policies. The battle for the lira intentionally hurt exports to draw Italy out of international markets and start the process to self-sufficiency. It also began to mobilize economic forces in the interests of the fascist state. Autarky first was not a policy born out of pragmatism, but rather existed through the entirety of the regime. Italy was ready to be launched into the second phase of fascist economics with aggressive modernization and autarkic development. Fascism was to mobilize the nation behind these policies and prepare the nation for war. The economic meltdown in the 1930s only catalyzed this process. The Depression hit Italy hard, like it did to many other countries. How hard is subject to debate. Some argue that the recession was actually much shallower than in most European countries, whilst others argue that the Depression was larger and deeper, with a 25% drop in manufacturing, for example. Whatever the effects of the Depression, it catalyzed the efforts for self-sufficiency as global trade collapsed. Imports had to be licensed, and by 1935 Italy had developed an elaborate infrastructure capable of monitoring foreign trade. Parastatal agencies flourished in this period. Acai was set up to explore Italy's coal reserves, while Agip was set up for oil. Safni was also set up to increase fertilizer production through investment and by promoting cartelization. Research was conducted on the production of liquid fuels, hydroelectricity, and the exploitation of marginal coal and aluminium reserves. These were largely independent from an administration, totally ignored the corporations, and were the responsibility of the immediate fascist leadership. They came to dominate huge amounts of the economy, with 80% of credit, for example, being held by parastatal firms. This proved to be the political economy that fascists dreamed of. Huge resources were mobilized in tuning the economy for war, the final political goal for fascism. Fiat and Alfa Romeo went from producing cars and trucks to producing fighter planes and engines. The most significant of the parastatal agencies and the most successful was IRI, or the Istituto per la Ricostruzione Industriale. It was created in 1933 as a state-controlled holding company. In 1933, due to the crash, many Italian firms were on the verge of bankruptcy. These firms would be unable to pay back debt, threatening their whole banking system with collapse. In order to free banks from this debt, IRI was formed to buy out these debts. During the period 1933-1936, IRI bought a tremendous amount of assets and disposed of most of these assets. IRI gained control of Italy's three most important commercial banks, BCI, Credito Italiano, and Banca di Roma. Designed to be a temporary solution, in 1937 it became a permanent agency due to the fascist push for dominance in the economy. IRI came to dominate most of Italian heavy industry. It created semi-autonomous sub-holding companies called Finanziare that managed a particular sector, such as Finmare, which managed shipbuilding. IRI came to control 44% of the entire Italian capital stock, and by 1948 it controlled over 77% of iron production and 45% of steel production. The parastatal agencies expanded fascist control to all corners of the economy, and allowed fascism to use the economy as a political tool to reach its goal. The massive expansion of state intervention proved to be one of fascism's greatest legacies. Fascist economics mixed old and new means to reach an ideological end. But what were the effects of these policies, and did they succeed? The answer, as the listeners may know, is a resounding no. The Italy that went into World War II was not at all a self-sufficient Italy nor a corporatist one. Fascist economic policies may have increased grain yields, chemical and steel production, but relative to other countries it was punitive. Sure, the trains may have been modernized, but it wasn't a phenomenon only found in Italy. Domestic production met only 1/5 of its raw material needs, and steel and coal were very, very expensive. Agip, responsible for finding oil, proved to be a white elephant project, eating up money and providing little to no oil, leaving the entire armed forces reliant on imported oil, a fact that doomed the navy to port for most of the war. 22% of Italian wheat was still imported, and the only resource that Italy produced in quantities high enough to make at least 1% of global production was aluminium. The simple fact was that Italy couldn't just pull resources from thin air. Ethiopia still needed billions of lire to produce anything of use for Italy, and commercial penetration to the Balkans had been swooped up by Germany instead. Italy would be starved of every important resource during the war, being dependent on German coal and Romanian oil imports that soon enough became pretty haphazard. Fiat and Spa made 2,500 vehicles a month in 1941, but made over 4,000 in 1938, and steel production actually fell during the war. Fascist economic policies, while allowing the political control of the economy, failed miserably to actually reach fascist core principles in relation to the economy. The price was paid by the Italian people, who had to endure some of the lowest standards of living in Europe, as wages were cut to fund Italy's autarkic drive and the war effort. Despite failing, fascist economic policies had, interestingly, an immense legacy in post-war Italy. It left a huge public sector in the hands of the Republic, which continued to serve it well into the 70s and 80s. IRI, despite its birth in the fascist regime, was not disbanded after World War II and played a crucial role in the Italian economic miracle. It also left a strong tradition of political control in the economy. It's very interesting that in the post-war world, in other countries this entire system of political control would have been dismantled, but in Italy it was actually utilised and expanded rapidly. The hundreds of quangos fascism created in all aspects of life were repurposed by the Republic and the mass parties into helping them achieve their political goals. Just like IRI was answerable only to the immediate fascist leadership, these parallel-state organizations became the industrial arms of the major party, especially the DC or the Christian Democrats. Every little company was split up amongst the major parties in something called lottazione. It was this that led to the clientelistic explosion in post-war Italy. The many quangos were full of jobs ripped for picking, and a culture of job for the boys and pure corruption became quickly ingrained in Italian society. Funds of public firms were plundered to provide financing for political parties, a process that eventually led to the collapse of the entire political system in the 90s. The fascist dream of a politically controlled economy was achieved in all the wrong ways.